Welcome everyone. Today I have a special treat for you. We're going to be doing a deck breakdown / archetype guide for green-red aggro in Dominaria United Sealed and Limited. This is Robot Rallis you're watching. I hope that you're going to enjoy this one. So we have the cards sorted currently by mana cost, but I'm going to do something interesting here. Now, as you can see, the cards are sorted into 4 main groups, and these are tiers. Wooded Ridgeline belongs in its own tier, since it's mana fixing, and I guess I'll get this one out of the way right now. So in the red-green aggressive deck, sometimes you'll play an additional tap land or two to kind of make like kicker cards a little bit better, like a Kelden strike team. If you end up with the Grove that taps for white and green, you might play it so that on the off chance that you draw it, and the strike team, you can kick it. But generally you don't want too many tap lands in this deck, and I think maximum you want about 4. And even that's a good, a little bit higher than I'd like. I think 3 is pretty much the max I'm happy with. 4 I'll play, but it'll be a little awkward on some draws. We're going to start with the lowest tier, which is War Stalker. And this card I'm not convinced is even vaguely good. I've seen it attack for 5 damage before, and I'm still not convinced. I think the biggest problem with it is that it doesn't really do enough with 1 toughness. There's so many incidental ways to create tokens to blank 1/1s or anything with 1 toughness that this just really hurts. Especially with one of the more premier decks in the format being Defenders, which has several creatures that have high toughness and at least 1 power, which makes this card a real mess of a card to play against them. Additionally, white has, at common, at least 3 different ways to make a 1/1 token consistently, I believe, and then in uncommon it gets even worse. So War Stalker, not the 1-drop you're looking for. Now we have these cards, and you may see a commonality between them all. They're all 5 mana. Now I think that Dominaria United is a pretty aggressive format, and for that reason I think the best thing you can do is try to get under some of the decks that are taking longer to build up synergy, or try and get a whole bunch of cards together to like build up some kind of combo. Especially domain decks that are stumbling on mana, you want to punish them. And so big giant clunky 5 mana cards that kind of just end up trading for like a Yavimaya Sojourner on average are not really what we're looking for, since not only are they not strong enough to finish the game on their own usually by the time they come down, but they also just trade for some of those other creatures. That's not a combination I'm fond of. So Linebreaker Baloth is the first, and it is a creature you can play in these decks, but as I said before, we're not looking to play too many 5s, if any at all. It has a good evasion ability, which is why it even makes it to this tier. Otherwise a 5 mana 4/5 with Enlist probably wouldn't make it at all. The evasion ability means that you can get past most of the Death Touch creatures in the format, which is one of the main things you want to be avoiding with bigger creatures. That's one of the reasons that a lot of the big creatures in this format kind of suck, unless they specifically have Trample or Evasion. They get blocked by a Battlefly Swarm or a Deathbloom Gardener and die on the spot. Hurler Cyclops is next, and it has a different kind of evasion in the form of a Sacrifice Outlet. So it may not seem like a lot, but I promise you this card will deliver to your opponent. One of the common lines of play is you attack with this and all the rest of your creatures. All of the creatures that get blocked, you will sacrifice with the Hurler Cyclops to deal your opponent extra damage. So not only do you get through with some number of creatures hopefully, but you also get 3, maybe 4 damage off of the sacrifice ability if you've flooded the board enough and your opponent doesn't have the best blocks ever. Also, another thing you can do, you can actually game the system with this card a good amount if your opponent has a lifelink creature. You can block an attacking lifelink creature and then sacrifice it so the lifelink creature doesn't deal any damage. And you can also sacrifice out from underneath an attacking creature that would otherwise be blocked by a lifelink creature. Just some things to think about that make this card a good deal better than it looks on its face, even though it doesn't look bad on its face. Jaya's Firenado is next, and it's kind of exactly what you would expect, just big, clunky removal spells. I think this is the most likely card for me to play as a 5 in the red-green aggressive deck if I'm looking to be more low curve, and it will still function, but goddamn, are there some ways inside the format to just blow this out of the water. Both black and white and green have ways to blow this out completely against anything that's actually worth blowing up. So black has one that gives Death Touch and Indestructible, white has one that gives Lifelink and Indestructible, and green just has +3/+3 or +4/+4, which is a real beating. The last thing you want to do is tap out on your turn to cast this. Your spell is countered by a 2-mana combat trick, and then you can't even attack that turn because their creature's indestructible. It's a pretty big risk, and I've not been very impressed with this one. Now we have these cards here in the second tier. These cards are cards that you'll play some amount of the time, but they need to be justified. They're not bad, they just require some amount of setup, whereas these cards are actively like worsening your game plan if you're doing the ideal version of this deck. Rulik Mons, the Warren Chief, is a fine card. I'm not too terribly fond of 4-mana 3/3 menace creatures, but it's fine. It gives you some extra value. It goes well with combat tricks, which this deck definitely will be playing, and it's also a legend. And there are a few things in the set that care about legends. Magna Goth Sentry is next. Well, one of the other reasons I'm not giving Rulik Mons higher up is because there aren't that many things that benefit it as it is a legend. Now there's only, I think, 2 things in the format. One of them is an equipment that is marginal at the best of times, and I don't think basically ever should be played inside this deck. And, oh god, what was the other one? I don't remember, but it'll be keeping me up for a while. Magna Goth Sentry is next, and in aggressive decks, this functions like a vanilla 4/4 for 4 mana. Reach doesn't do anything on attacks, so really, you're just attacking with a 4/4. If you need that, it'll be there, and it's better than like a 5-drop usually. Like, realistically, the difference between attacking with a 4/4 and attacking with a 4/5, pretty small. The fact that this one's more evasive, or rather this one's more evasive than this one, doesn't really matter all that much when you consider the mana discount. Hex Bain Tortoise is next, and my big complaint with this card is that it has 2 toughness and a 3 mana for its cost. The thing about enlist creatures that have 2 toughness is that you want them to be cheap, very cheap. That way you can start enlisting as fast as possible. This one doesn't do anything extra to compensate you besides Ward 2, and you're not really concerned about your creatures getting hit by individual removal spells, since the quality of your creatures is not so drastically changed from one to another. You're playing a lot of things that are relatively homogeneous both in their effects and their impact on the board and their threat level to your opponent. So them removing one thing isn't a big deal. Removing Hex Bain Tortoise being slightly more difficult isn't a big problem. And this still does just trade for anything with 2 toughness, and that is the reason why it's in tier 2 instead of tier 1. Bog Badger is next. Now on its face, this might look like just a vanilla 3/3 for 3, but that's not the case. It can be, and it will still be perfectly fine inside your deck if it is, but if you get any of the black lands, a black-red or a black-green land, the mire or the bog, you'll be more than happy to put one of these in here, and every once in a while get to kick it for massive value. It is extremely worthwhile to throw one of those lands in your deck if you have a Bog Badger. The change in tempo will be worth randomly getting to kill your opponent when they have like 3 blockers out and thought that their board state was safe. Kelden Strike Team is next, and this card doesn't look very impressive at all. In fact, it looks really bad. In fact, I just gave a card a pretty low grade just a moment ago for having 1 toughness, so what does this do better? Haste. The fact that it has haste is quite nice. The kicker is also nice. All the things I said about Bog Badger kind of apply here. The additional power and toughness with haste is nice, but really the kicker for this card is only the bonus. The main meat of this card is the fact that it has haste, and why is that? Because of Enlist. You play a 2-drop creature with Enlist, and then your Kelden Strike Team immediately can pump that thing up to a 5 power creature, which can attack into almost every creature in the format at common and uncommon, besides a few minor outliers like Yavimaya Sojourner. So Kelden Strike Team, definitely a playable, but you do need to have like a reason and a desire to play a 3/1 for 3 mana. Mostly you're going to need the cheap removal to get 1 toughness creatures out the way and 2 drops. Also, you'll want to make sure that your opponent can't just block with random defenders with 1 power. Thrill of Possibilities next, and this usually ends up being the 23rd card or so inside of my red-green aggressive decks. The biggest problem with it is that when you're playing the aggressive red-green strategy, you're trying to get a critical mass of creatures, and when you're doing that, it can be pretty difficult to find spell slots. The spell slots are often reserved for removal and combat tricks, your primary 2 ways of finishing the game when your opponent plays out creatures like they will be doing in Limited. So Thrill of Possibility is a fine card, it is just competing with a lot of other things. Furious Bellow is a fine combat trick, but it suffers from being inside of a format where the combat tricks otherwise just beat it. So what am I talking about? Let's say you attack into your opponent's 4/4 with your 2/2, and you cast a Furious Bellow. Cool, you're all set to kill that creature. But the combat tricks that they have will grant indestructible more often than not. We have one in black and 1 in white. And that just beats the hell out of this. The lifelink one, you can actually manage to beat by using a card like Colossal Growth that will save your creature, and theirs just won't die, and they'll be up some life in the exchange, but that's okay. But the black one is going to be, I guess, all of them, because it gives Death Touch. I've definitely been got on more than one occasion by using Furious Bellow, where Colossal Growth would have just been better for me. Also, Colossal Growth can be 4 instead of 3, and it can also give you Trample, which on some of the Enlist creatures can be invaluable for pushing through damage in the late game. So this is a fine card in many formats, I'd say, but just not really what I'm looking for in this one sometimes. Electrostatic Infantry is next. This is a great card in blue-red for obvious reasons, but it can also be played in red-green. You just have to have it inside of a deck where you're consistently going to be casting multiple spells after you play this. Obviously it's best on turn 2, and then backed up by like a Flowstone Infusion and maybe something else. But if you just play it, and it becomes a 2-mana 2/3, well, you've only made it playable. You need to have it be a 2-mana like 3/4 before you're really happy about it. Otherwise, you may as well just take a card like a Flowstone Cavu or a Yavimaya Steel Crusher, because those are on rate going to be better than the Electrostatic Infantry if you're not casting the spells. We saved the last and best tier for, well, last. First up we have Enthrall to the Pit. Enthrall to the Pit is a very powerful finisher. There have been many games where my opponent has played some kind of big thing after a removal war and some trading, and thought, well, I'm safe now, nothing can go wrong. And then, boom, I cast this card, I take their Yavimaya Sojourner or whatever, I attack them with it, and they die. It can definitely force some pretty uncomfortable situations for your opponent. Obviously, it's a little bit better inside of black-red, and obviously you don't want to ever get to the point where you can kick this, even though it does have the ability. But it's still a very powerful card, and probably one of the things I'm looking to do at 4, if anything. Coalition Warbrute is the only other thing at 4 mana that I actively want to play in every single red-green deck that I have, because it has Trample and it has Enlist, and those two abilities together are extremely strong. Enough said. Heirloom Battle Hymn. It is a little bit on the pricey side, but this is a really good card to use in conjunction with a bunch of your other cards. Specifically the Coalition Warbrute, the Flowstone Cavu, and anything else with Trample, like the Neshoba Brawler, as well as any menace creatures you have, like Rulikmons. Basically anything that demands attention from your opponent's creatures to block with, you can blow them out pretty hard with the Heirloom Battle Hymn. If they are double blocking with a bigger creature and a smaller creature, you can often kill the bigger creature with this and get your 2-for-1 pretty easy. Also, you can get into racing situations where if you ever get a chance to kick this, the 4 life is actually a lot of life. 4 is a very good amount in this format, and that can easily swing a race in your direction if for some reason you're losing it. Flowstone Cavu is next, and this is a card that I heavily underrated during my set review, and not just because the art looks really weird, but because I just felt like it wasn't going to do much. I was wrong. I was extremely wrong. This card is a serious threat. If you play a 2 and they don't play something and you untap and play this, your opponent is in a lot of trouble. A lot of trouble. This thing attacks for a lot. It works extremely well with combat tricks. By the time it gets to the point where your opponent can mount a reasonable defense against it, often you can just pump it and trade for both of those creatures. All in all, this card is very nice. It gets in way more often than you might think it would. The only deck it's not great against is white, but even then, there are plenty of ways for you to get around that. Random combat tricks work incredibly well, especially if you're the beatdown, the place where combat tricks and cheap removal are the best. Balduvian Berserker is a very strong card. It is an uncommon that I'm always happy to pick up, because it usually ends up attacking for 3. And a 3/3 that attacks for 3, well, a 3-mana creature that attacks for 3 and if it trades kills something else is very nice. It can also attack relatively easily into Yavimaya Sojourner, a 4/6, which a lot of creatures in the format just cannot do profitably whatsoever. If you're trading your Balduvian Berserker for a Yavimaya Sojourner, you're going to be happy with that exchange. And sometimes you can enlist even more than the 2-power creature, and if you do that, you're definitely in the money, because this thing forces your opponent to make some tough decisions. Yavimaya Iconoclast is next, and it is by far one of the beefiest and most aggressive cards inside the deck. There's a reason that you rarely see it. It is because the person who is playing green is going to snap it up easy, because it's a very strong card. It's especially good with cards like Bite Down and Tail Swipe, but also you can just play it in this deck and kill your opponents with it without any of those things. Since it has Trample, it works quite well with any kind of pump spells, and the kicker ability on top just makes it a serious beating on turn 3. Like any 2-drop into this, and you're just attacking for 1 billion. And if you end up with specifically a Yavimaya Steel Crusher, you can attack for 6 with your enlist creature. And that's a pretty big amount. Of course, like, there's going to be times when you don't want to attack with the enlist creature and enlist it, but yeah, it's neither here nor there. Rootwalla is next, and Rootwalla is just a generally good 2-mana creature. It is a fine attacker and blocker. However, the real meat and potatoes behind this card is that it doesn't take a lot of work to make this 3 instead of 2. You just need like 1/2 off-color land, and suddenly this thing has a lot more value in the late game than it otherwise would. You can also pump it and then enlist it for a sizable bonus. Neshoba Brawler is just a fine beater. You're going to be happy with it as a 2/3, which it will be most of the time, but if it's ever a 3/3, or somehow more, you're going to be extremely happy. Just a fine creature, works with all of your combat tricks, works with all of your removal pretty well, just you're generally good. Colossal Growth is the most important trick for your deck. This is the way that you both win combat and also keep dealing damage to your opponent. As you can see, the creatures with specifically trample tend to rate much higher than other creatures, and this is one of the ways that you're going to give the creatures with trample the ability to push through damage and get past blockers without having to kick it, and the creatures that don't have trample, you're going to give them trample with this and kill your opponent. This is also a card that will just kill your opponent out of nowhere if they don't block well enough. +4/+4 at instant speed will just end game sometimes if you're getting through with a random 1/1 or something. Of course, like any other combat trick, you have to be aware of the fact that this format does contain other ones, and the format contains 2 combat tricks that grant indestructible. One of them also grants lifelink, so keep that in mind. The other grants death touch, and will always beat this one, and be really bad for you, just a straight up 2 for 1, but the lifelink one can put a race in the other direction pretty quick. Bite Down is an extremely important card for this deck. It's probably the best removal spell that you'll be playing, because it can get rid of very large creatures on the cheap and permit you to do some attacking when otherwise you wouldn't be able to. Now, you may be sensing a bit of a trend here. A lot of these cards work together extremely well, a lot of micro synergies that just sort of add up to do great things, like the Steel Crusher enlisting to a 4-power creature that you can then bite down with to get rid of something that has 4 toughness. That's a great little micro combo right there. Additionally, Colossal Growth on any creature pretty much makes it impossible for Bite Down to not kill the creature you're going to target with it. So that's also pretty nice. Yavimaya Steel Crusher is, I think, the best 2-mana creature that this deck can get. Enlist is a very powerful ability, and it scales very well as the game goes on. The thing that I didn't like about Enlist creatures with 2 toughness at the beginning of the format is that they trade with anything. But that same exact statement can just be reworked to mean they trade for anything. As in, they trade up. They don't just trade down, they trade even, and they trade up. You're never trading down when you attack with the Yavimaya Steel Crusher, unless your opponent just has something free laying around that can kill it on blocks. You're always trading either sideways or straight up with it into a 4 toughness creature, or a 5, or sometimes even a 6. And for that reason, this is the probably most important card for the deck. Just something that attacks and blocks at 2, and also just an all-star in the limited format as a whole. I'm usually looking to get about 3 of these in any given red-green draft deck, but if I get less than that, I'll just be actually sad, because it's that good. Sprouting Goblin is next, and it is an extremely strong uncommon. Of course, you can play it on turn 2 if your goal is to just attack and block and you don't have anything better to do, but the real value of this card is that it enables any splash that you have very easily, and it also has an incredibly powerful late game ability to sacrifice lands that you don't need to draw cards that you do need, and that's quite strong on a 2. Overall, this is an extremely powerful card. Lightning Strike is next. Extremely simple. 2 mana to deal 3. I don't really need to explain this one. You'll play about as many of them as you get past. Goblin Picker's next. As you can see, we have a creature at common that makes your late game better by getting rid of cards you don't need for cards you do need. And similar to the Sprouting Goblin, it costs a red mana and a tap to activate, and it has a similar grade. It's an extremely powerful card. It's fine on turn 2. You're going to attack with it and block with it a good amount of the time. Its general use tends to be being enlisted by the Yavimaya Steel Crusher, but it is more than capable of holding its own in the late game by discarding cards you don't need to draw once you do. And for that reason, it's way up here on the high end. This isn't in any order, by the way. I just put like all of the good green-red cards here, and then all of the solid green-red cards here, then all of the clunky ones, and then the worst one. Next up is Tail Swipe. It is like a bite down that's a little bit more difficult to use. There are situations where you don't really want to fight a creature, you just want to bite it, but this is 1 mana, and the versatility of a 1 mana spell I'm not going to really call under question. You do have to be aware though that because it's a fight, there are going to be turns when you're going to play this out and then you can't attack with the creature that you used to Tail Swipe. And that's okay. You got your 1 mana removal spell, maybe you got to play out another creature that turn. That's what you're looking to do. You're not really too concerned about the lost tempo. You traded your 1 mana card for their however many mana card. Viashino Branch Rider is pretty much the negative version of the War Stalker. Every criticism I have of the War Stalker, this thing just fixes. It's much easier to get this to attack for mana, for more damage, both in the early game and in the late game. And in the late game, you can also kick it to make it permanently a 3/3 instead of a 3/1 at most if you're playing 2 creatures, which is not going to happen as often the later the game goes. Overall, if you're looking for 1-drops, you're not going to do any better than this besides our next card, Phoenix Chick. This is an extremely powerful card. It's very easy to get it back from your graveyard if it goes there, but if you play it on turn 1, it's probably going to peck in for somewhere between, peck in, no pun intended, for somewhere between 3 and 7 damage. That is how good this card is. It's not terribly difficult to play, only costs a single red, just 2 to get it back, very easy. You do have to be aware of the fact that it can't block, but often you're just going to be attacking with it anyway, so it generally doesn't matter that much. Last card is Flowstone Infusion, a card that plays better than it looks. You just have to keep in mind that you can't really use it as a combat trick. It does just function like a straight up removal spell that also has a random +2 bonus attached to it if you randomly need to deal an extra 2 to your opponent. It's very nice, and you're going to pick it very often in this deck because you can, on turn 3, play this to get rid of a 2/2, play another one of your own 2/2s, and keep pushing forward that damage while keeping things like combat tricks inside your hand for creatures that a Flowstone Infusion can't deal with. Well, that's all of the cards. Now let's talk about the general strategy. It's going to depend a lot on your hand, whether or not you have a lot of creatures left in there, whether or not you have removal spells, or whether or not you have pump spells. When you have more pump spells than you have creatures, obviously what you want to do is leverage your pump spells to survive combat and win against creatures that otherwise you're going to have some trouble getting through. You need to know when to trade and when to just accept that your creature is going to die, and know when to use your pump spells to leverage your value as best as you can. In general, the creatures with abilities are good to keep around, but never be afraid to just let go of them if you have more inside your hand. If you have more creatures inside of your hand, what you want to do is sandbag those pump spells until there are creatures that you can't get through at all with pump spells, or without pump spells rather. If you could just get through those creatures or trade for them, that's fine. Keep doing that until they play something that you literally can't get through unless you use your Bite Down or your Colossal Growth or what have you. Otherwise, you're going to find your opponent playing like a Yavimaya Sojourner, and suddenly all of your attacks look like shit. And that is the eventuality you want to avoid. I think overall, green-red is probably in first place for power level, for me at least, based on the fact that all of its cards have these like micro synergies that feed into each other really well. The strategy is sound. It's not overly complex. It's actually a very simple deck. It's very easy to get into. You don't need a lot of high rarity cards, although they definitely help. Overall, just very simple and efficient. I think black-white is second, and then red-white is probably third, in my estimation. And then back there a little ways, you're going to have like domain. And the criteria for this is not like the highest high, it's the average case. And I think in the average case, this deck is just better than most of those other ones. And black-white's definitely better than most of those other ones, but I don't know if it's better than this one. And then red-white is definitely worse than those first two, in first and second place, but probably still better than the other ones, like specifically domain. Alright, well, that has concluded my archetype breakdown for green-red. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy content like this, please feel free to like, share, subscribe, and possibly leave a comment. You've been watching Robot Rallis. Have yourself a wonderful night, and soon enough we'll be having an archetype breakdown, as well as another episode of Limited State, on black, white, and other archetypes inside the format.